Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading Chapter 1 of Mass Effect Revelation, so let's get into it. Chapter 1. 8 years later. Staff Lieutenant David Anderson, Executive Officer on the SSV Hastings, rolled out of his bunk at the first sound of the alarm. His body moved instinctively, conditioned by years of active service aboard Systems Alliance space vessels. By the time his feet hit the floor, he was already awake and alert, his mind evaluating the situation. The alarm rang again, echoing off the hull to rebound throughout the ship. 2 short blasts repeating over and over. A general call to stations. At least they weren't under immediate attack. As he pulled his uniform on, Anderson ran through the possible scenarios. The Hastings was a patrol vessel in the Skyllian Verge, an isolated region on the farthest fringes of Alliance space. Their primary purpose was to protect the dozens of human colonies and research outposts scattered across the sector. A general call to stations probably meant they'd spotted an unauthorized vessel in Alliance territory. Either that, or they were responding to a distress call. Anderson hoped it was the former. It wasn't easy getting dressed in the tight confines of the sleeping quarters he shared with 2 other crewmen, but he'd had lots of practice. In less than a minute, he had his uniform on, his boots secured, and was moving quickly through the narrow corridors toward the bridge, where Captain Belliard would be waiting for him. As the executive officer, it fell to Anderson to relay the captain's orders to the enlisted crew, and to make sure those orders were properly carried out. Space was the most precious resource on any military vessel, and Anderson was constantly reminded of this as he encountered other crewmen heading in the opposite direction as they rushed to their assigned posts. Invariably, they would press themselves against the corridor walls in an effort to let Anderson by, snapping off awkward salutes to the superior as he squeezed past them. But despite the cramped conditions, the entire process was carried out with an efficiency and crisp precision that was the hallmark of every crew in the Alliance fleet. Anderson was almost at his destination. He was passing navigation, where he noticed a pair of junior officers making rapid calculations and applying them to a 3-dimensional star chart projected above their consoles. They each gave their XO a curt but respectful nod as he passed, too engrossed in their duties to be encumbered by the formality of a true salute. Anderson responded with a grim tilt of his head. He could see they were plotting a route through the nearest mass relay. That meant the Hastings was responding to a distress call. And the brutal truth was that more often than not, their response came too late. In the years following the First Contact War, humanity had spread out too far and too fast. They didn't have enough ships to properly patrol a region the size of the Verge. Settlers who lived out here knew the threat of attacks and raids was all too real, and too often the Hastings touched down on a world only to find a small but thriving colony reduced to corpses, burned-out buildings, and a handful of shell-shocked survivors. Anderson still hadn't found a good way to cope with being a first-hand witness to that kind of death and destruction. He'd seen action during the war, but this was different. That had been primarily ship-to-ship warfare, killing enemy combatants from tens of thousands of kilometers away. It wasn't the same as picking through the charred rubble and blackened bodies of civilians. The First Contact War, despite its name, had been a short and relatively bloodless campaign. It began an Alliance patrol inadvertently trespassed on the territory of the Turian Empire. For humanity, it had been their first encounter with another intelligent species. For the Turians, it was an invasion by an aggressive and previously unknown race. Misunderstanding and overreaction on both sides had led to several intense battles between patrols and scout fleets, but the conflict never erupted into full-scale planetary war. The escalating hostilities and sudden deployment of Turian fleets had drawn the attention of the greater galactic community, luckily for humanity. It turned out the Turians were only one species among a dozen, each independent but voluntarily united beneath the rule of a governing body known as the Citadel Council. Eager to prevent interstellar war with the newly emerged humans, the Council had intervened, revealing itself to the Alliance and brokering a peaceful resolution between them and the Turians. Less than 2 months after it had begun, the First Contact War was officially over. 623 human lives had been lost. Most of the casualties were sustained in the first encounter and during the Turian attack on Shanks. Turian losses were slightly higher. The Alliance fleet sent to liberate the captured outpost had been ruthless, brutal, and very thorough, but on a galactic scale the losses to both sides were minor. Humanity had been pulled back from the brink of a potentially devastating war, and instead became the newest member of a vast interstellar pan-species society. Anderson climbed the 3 steps separating the forward deck of the bridge from the main level of the ship. Captain Belliard was hunched over a small view screen, studying a stream of incoming transmissions. He stood up straight as Anderson approached, and returned his executive officer's salute with one of his own. "We've got trouble, Lieutenant. We picked up a distress call when we linked up to the comm relays," the captain explained by way of greeting. "I was afraid of that, sir. It came from Sidon." "Sidon?" Anderson recognized the name. "Don't we have a research base there?" Belliard nodded. "A small one. 15 security personnel, 12 researchers, 6 support staff." Anderson frowned. This was no ordinary attack. Raiders preferred to hit defenseless settlements and bug out before Alliance reinforcements arrived on the scene. A well-defended base like Sidon wasn't their typical target. It felt more like an act of war. The Turians were allies of the Human Systems Alliance now, at least officially, and the Skyllian Verge was too far removed from Turian territory for them to get involved in any conflicts out here. But there were other species vying with humanity for control of the region. The Alliance was in direct competition with the Batarian government to establish a presence in the Verge. But so far, the 2 rival species had managed to avoid any real violence in their confrontations. Anderson doubted they'd start with something like this. Still, there were plenty of other groups out there with the means and motive to hit an Alliance stronghold. Some of them were even made up of humans, non-affiliated terrorist organizations, and multi-species guerrilla factions eager to strike a blow against the powers that be, illegal paramilitary troops looking to stock up on high-grade weapons, independent mercenary bands hoping for one big score. Might be helpful to know that Sidon was what Sidon was working on, Captain, Anderson suggested. "They're a top security clearance facility," the captain replied with a shake of his head. "I can't even get schematics for the base. Never mind get anyone to tell me what they were working on." Anderson frowned. Without schematics, his team would be going in blind, giving up any tactical advantage they might have had from knowing the layout of the battleground. This mission just kept getting better and better. "What's our ETA, sir?" 46 minutes. Finally, some good news. The Hastings followed random patrol routes. It was pure chance they happened to be this close to the source of the distress call. With luck, they could still get there in time. "I'll have the ground team ready, Captain." "You always do, Lieutenant." Anderson turned to go, acknowledging his commanding officer's compliment with a simple, "Aye, aye, sir." In the black void of space, the Hastings was all but invisible to the naked eye, surrounded by a self-generated Mass Effect field and traveling nearly 50 times faster than the speed of light. It was little more than a flickering blur, a slight wavering in the fabric of the space-time continuum. The vessel altered its flight path as the helmsman made a quick course correction, a minor adjustment to the trajectory that sent the ship hurtling toward the nearest mass relay, nearly 5 billion kilometers away. At a speed of nearly 15 million kilometers per second, it didn't take long before their destination was in range. 10,000 kilometers out from their target, the helmsman took the Element Zero drive core offline, disengaging the Mass Effect fields. Blue shifted energy waves radiated off the ship as it dropped out of FTL, igniting the darkness of space like a flare. The illumination of the blazing ship reflected off the mass relay, growing steadily larger on the horizon. Although completely alien in design, the construction closely resembled an enormous gyroscope. At its center was a sphere made up of 2 concentric rings, spinning around a single axis. Each ring was nearly 5 kilometers across, and 2 15-kilometer arms protruded out from one end of the constantly rotating middle. The entire structure sparkled and flashed with white bursts of crackling energy. At a signal from the Alliance vessel, the mass relay began to move. It turned ponderously on its axis, orienting itself with a linked relay hundreds of light years away. The Hastings picked up speed as it headed straight for the center of the enormous alien construct on a pre-calculated approach vector. The rings at the relay's heart began to spin faster, accelerating until they were nothing but a whirling blur. The sporadic bursts of energy emanating from its core became a solid, pulsing glow, growing in strength and intensity until it was almost impossible to look at. The Hastings was less than 500 kilometers away when the relay fired. A discharge of dark energy swept out from the spinning rings like a wave, engulfing the ship. It shimmered momentarily, then disappeared as if snuffed out of existence. Instantaneously, it winked back into reality 1,000 light years from its previous location, emerging from apparent nothingness with a bright blue flash in the vicinity of a completely different mass relay. The drive core of the Hastings roared to life, and it jumped to FTL, vanishing into the darkness with a red-shifted burst of heat and radiation. Rapidly left behind, the receiving relay began to power down, the rings at its center already decelerating. We've cleared the mass relay, engaging drive core. ETA to side on, 26 minutes. Huddled in the cargo hold with the other 4 members of the ground team, it was almost impossible to hear the sound of the voice coming over the shipboard intercom above the roaring of the engines. Not that Anderson needed to hear the updates to know what was happening. His stomach was still churning from the jump through the mass relay. Scientifically, he knew the motion sickness shouldn't happen. Travel between relays, the jump from an originating or transmitting relay to the destination or receiving relay, was an instantaneous event. It took no time to occur. Therefore, it couldn't possibly have any physical effect on his body. But while he acknowledged this theoretical fact, Anderson knew from first-hand experience that it wasn't true in practice. Maybe this time, the tightness in his gut was just a bad feeling about what they'd find when they reached the Sidon facility. Whoever had attacked the research base had been willing to take on 15 Alliance Marines. Even using the element of surprise to their advantage, they must have been a formidable force. The Alliance should be sending a troop transport in as reinforcements, not a patrol frigate that could only assemble a 5-person ground team. But nobody else was close enough to answer the distress call in time, and most Alliance vessels were too big to go planet-side anyway. The Hastings was small enough to enter a world's atmosphere and touch down on its surface, and still be able to take off again. Anything bigger than a frigate would have to ferry troops down using shuttles or drop ships, and they didn't have time for that. At least they were going in heavy. Every member of the ground team was wearing body armor equipped with fully charged kinetic shield generators, as well as 3/4 visored headgear. They each carried half a dozen grenades, and the Alliance's standard issue Han Kadar G912 assault rifle. The ammo clip on each weapon held over 4,000 rounds, miniature pellets smaller than grains of sand. When fired at sufficient velocity, the nearly microscopic projectiles were capable of inflicting massive damage. That was the real problem. No matter how advanced defensive technology got, it was always a step behind. The Alliance spared no expense when it came to protecting its soldiers. Their body armor was top of the line, and their kinetic shields were the latest military prototype. But it still wasn't enough to withstand a direct hit from close range with heavy weapons. If they were going to survive this mission, it wasn't going to be because of their equipment. It always came down to two things: training and leadership. Their lives were in Anderson's hands now, and he could sense their unease. Alliance Marines were well trained to deal with the mental and physical stress of the human body's natural fight-or-flight instincts, but this was more than the normal adrenaline rush of impending combat. He'd been careful not to expose his own doubts. He'd projected an image of absolute confidence and composure. But the members of his team were smart enough to figure things out on their own. They could put the pieces together just as he had. Like the lieutenant, they knew ordinary raiders wouldn't attack the heavily defended Alliance base. Anderson didn't believe in giving motivational speeches. They were all professionals here. But even for Alliance soldiers, those last nervous minutes before a mission were harder to endure in total silence. Besides, there was no sense hiding from the truth. "Everyone stay sharp," he said, knowing the rest of the team could hear him clearly over the rumbling of the engines through the radios inside their helmets. "I get the feeling this wasn't just some slavers pulling a quick grab and run." "Batarian, sir?" The question came from Gunnery Chief Jill Daw. A year older than Anderson, she'd already been an Alliance Marine on active duty back when he was still taking N7 training at Arcturus. They'd served in the same unit during the First Contact War. She stood just over 6'3", making her taller than most of the men she served with. She was stronger than a lot of them too, judging by her wide shoulders, the well-defined muscles of her arms, and her generally large but not ill-proportioned frame. Some of the other soldiers in the unit had called her Amy, short for Amazon, but never to her face. And when the fighting started, they were all glad to have her on their side. Anderson liked Daw, but she had a habit of rubbing people the wrong way. She didn't believe in diplomacy. If she had an opinion, she let everybody know it, which probably explained why she was still a non-commissioned officer. Still, the lieutenant realized that if she asked a question, it meant most of the others were probably wondering the exact same thing. "Let's not jump to any conclusions, Chief. Any idea what they were working on over at Sidon?" This time it was Corporal Ahmed O'Reilly, technicians expert, asking the question. "Classified. That's all I know. So be ready for anything." The other two members of the team, Private Second Class Indigo Lee and PFC Dan Shea, didn't bother to comment, and the team lapsed once more into an uneasy silence. Nobody felt good about this mission, but Anderson knew they'd follow his lead. He'd brought them through the fire enough times to earn their trust. Approaching Sidon, the intercom crackled. No response on any frequencies. That was grim news. If any Alliance personnel were still alive inside the base, they should have answered the Hastings call. Anderson slammed his visor down to shield his face, and the rest of the crew followed suit. A minute later, they felt the turbulence as the ship entered the tiny planet's atmosphere. At a nod from Anderson, his team made a final weapons comm and shields check. "We have a visual of the base," the intercom crackled. "No ships on the ground, and we're not picking up any non-Alliance vessels in the vicinity." "Damn cowards, already cut and ran," Anderson heard Daw mutter over the radio in his helmet. With the Hastings' quick response time, Anderson had been hoping they'd arrive to catch the enemy in the act, but he wasn't really surprised there were no other ships in the area. A raid against a target as well defended as Sidon would have required at least 3 vessels working together. The 2 larger ships would land on the surface and unload assault teams, while a small scout vessel would stay in orbit, monitoring the nearby mass relay for any signs of activity. The scout must have seen it spring to life as the Hastings approached the connecting relay on the far side of the region and radioed the ships on the ground. The advanced warning would have given them just enough time to lift off, clear the planet's atmosphere, and engage their FTL drives before the Hastings arrived. The ships involved in the attack on the base were long gone, but in their hurried escape they might have been forced to leave some of their troops behind. A few seconds later, there was a heavy thump as the ship touched down at the landing port of the Sidon research facility. The interminable waiting was over. The pressure door of the Hastings cargo hold hissed open, and the gangway ramp descended. "Ground team," came Captain Belliard's voice over the intercom. "You are clear for go." That's the end of Chapter 1. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 2.